The Global Phoenix Initiative, Neptune Falling, by Sanford Berenberg. Prologue. The moment it happened, the world's instruments registered it as a phantom whisper. On a Tuesday in early July, an anomaly was detected by a dozen deep space probes and radio telescopes. A mini black hole, no larger than a bowling ball, had entered our solar system. It was not a cosmic event of note, until it was. It zipped past Pluto and then Neptune, where its gravitational pull exerted a slight but noticeable tug on the gas giant's moons. Then, it happened. The black hole clipped Proteus, Neptune's second-largest moon, devouring it in a flash of impossible light. The event's immediate aftermath was a gravitational wave that pulled Triton, Neptune's largest moon, out of its stable orbit and sent it on a catastrophic collision course with its parent planet. Triton, a moon made of frozen nitrogen and methane, impacted with a force so immense that it exploded Neptune, sending shock waves across the solar system and altering its orbit. The black hole, its devastation complete, continued on its way, leaving behind a new cosmic time bomb. In 25 years, Neptune would collide with Earth. Scientists across the globe confirmed the event in a matter of weeks, their initial disbelief turning to cold, hard dread. The data was irrefutable. When the world's governments were briefed, panic ensued. World leaders, who a month ago were locked in trade disputes and territorial conflicts, now faced a common, existential enemy. They held a secret, unprecedented summit in a fortified bunker in Switzerland. There, a simple, terrifying question was asked: what do we do? The answer, as it emerged from a chorus of terrified voices, was the only one they had left: survival at any cost. The result was the Global Phoenix Initiative, GPI, a secret, supranational organization given absolute authority and a blank check. National militaries, space programs, and intelligence agencies were placed under its temporary emergency command. Public funds for social programs, infrastructure, and even healthcare were silently diverted into the GPI's black budget. The decision to do this was made in a single, unanimous vote, each leader willing to starve their own people for a chance at survival. They agreed that the global populace could not handle the truth. A simple, bland cover story: an asteroid was agreed upon to hide the reality. To lead this new world order, the UN Secretary-General appointed Anya Sharma. Her reputation as a ruthless but brilliant diplomat and an engineer with a history of getting the impossible done made her the perfect choice. She was given one instruction: save as many as you can. Her new organization had no moral code, no checks and balances, and no limits. Their only mission was to ensure that humanity, in some form, would endure. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Neptune Falling, by Sanford Berenberg. Chapter 1: The Director's Gamble. 5 years have passed from that secret global vote. Director Anya Sharma of the Global Phoenix Initiative sat across from a woman who didn't look like she belonged in the sterile high-security office. Dr. Kaylin Reed, a renowned anthropologist, was known for studying the effects of global upheaval on human societies, a field that had been considered academic esoterica until recently. Dr. Reed, Anya began, her voice a careful blend of authority and calm. Your research on cultural resilience in the face of existential threats is unparalleled. We've been following your work for years. Kaylin shifted in her chair, a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. With all due respect, Director, your organization's mission is veiled in secrecy. I'm not sure how my work on ancient civilizations applies to intergovernmental resource consolidation and asteroid defense. She used the official, publicly broadcasted GPI cover story. Anya's gaze was direct, unwavering. It doesn't. Not directly. What we're about to embark on is unprecedented. We need more than scientists and engineers. We need to understand the human factor, the very soul of humanity, if we're to have any hope of preserving it. Anya Sharma's past is rooted in a personal tragedy that shaped her into the formidable leader of the GPI. She grew up in a coastal city, where her father, a brilliant but disgraced engineer, worked on a flawed sea-level defense system. During a major storm, the system failed catastrophically, and her father, along with thousands of others, was lost. This event instilled in Anya a profound understanding of what happened when governments fail to act decisively, and an unwavering belief that human lives must be saved at all costs, even if it means sacrificing integrity. A buzzer sounded on Anya's desk. Please excuse me, Dr. Reed. An urgent meeting. As Kaylin was escorted to a waiting room, Anya was patched into a secure video conference. The faces of the world's most powerful leaders filled the screens. President Miller of the United States, Premier Li of China, Prime Minister Singh of India, President Volkov of Russia, and the British Foreign Secretary, all members of the GPI's core leadership. Progress report. Director Sharma. President Miller's voice boomed. The Mars project is on schedule, and the orbital pods are nearing production. But we're seeing increased resistance from this Church of the Dying Earth group, and the media is getting restless. Premier Lee's expression was impassive. Our intelligence indicates several nations are beginning to take unilateral actions to secure their own future. Population control. It's a cancer that must be contained. Indeed, Volkov replied, a wry smile on his face. And the so-called think tank, the corporate combine led by figures like Marcus Thorne, is attempting to steal our intellectual property and push their own narrative. They want to corner the market on survival. The conversation was cold, clinical. They were not talking about people but numbers. A global recession was looming as social programs were gutted to fund the GPI. Conspiracy theories were running rampant. The world was on the brink of chaos, and these leaders were debating how to manage the fallout. Suddenly, a voice cut through the sterile air, a projection on the screen of an older, weary scientist. Director, we've compiled the final report. He showed a diagram of a cosmic dance of death, the Global Phoenix Initiative, Neptune falling, Chapter 2. The cracks in the facade. Ben Carter lived by a clock that had nothing to do with the sun. It was governed by the flow of data, by the silent, relentless streams of information beamed back from the void. For 5 years the data had been telling him the truth, even as the world at large was fed a carefully constructed lie. Before he was a data analyst, Ben was an ambitious investigative journalist. He worked on a story exposing a local government's corruption, only to have his sources silenced and his evidence mysteriously erased. The experience left him disillusioned with traditional journalism and the media's susceptibility to powerful interests. He turned to data, believing that numbers, unlike people, could not lie. His obsessive nature and deep-seated suspicion of official narratives are a direct result of this past professional trauma. On the main television screen in the break room, a talking head from a major news network smiled brightly. Today in Washington, the Global Phoenix Initiative announced the successful launch of the Europa Clipper, another step forward in our mission to study distant comets and asteroids to better protect our planet. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, GPI. Safeguarding our future. Ben scoffed into his coffee. The Europa Clipper was, in a secret file on his terminal, designated as the Mars Scout Ship 1. Its real mission wasn't to study comets. It was to find the best landing sites for the massive Mars colonization modules being built under a dozen different corporate aliases. The asteroid cover story, once a whisper, was now the official, benign-sounding narrative, but the cracks were beginning to show. His fingers danced over the keyboard, a familiar rhythm of queries and filters. He was an archivist of a global secret, a lone sentry at the gate of a coming apocalypse. He found a news article buried deep on a financial news website, on the 22nd page of a report on global market trends. Social programs across the globe see a 15% funding cut. Analysts baffled. Another one reported on a sudden surge in construction projects on remote islands, which Ben knew were the launch sites for the orbital pods. The connections were all there for anyone with the time and access to make them. Ben's screen displayed the raw data from 5 years ago, the gravitational anomaly, the impossible blip. He had logged it as Event Alpha and had been tracking its ripple effects ever since. He knew the truth wasn't a rogue asteroid. It was a bowling ball-sized black hole that had for a fleeting moment rewritten the cosmic rulebook. He knew the name of the moon it had consumed, Proteus. He knew the catastrophic consequence, Neptune, now on a collision course with Earth. And the official story was a lie, so brazen, so transparent, it felt like an insult. His colleagues, most of them, didn't seem to notice. They were focused on the daily grind. The news about the asteroid was simply a small, uninteresting footnote in their lives, eclipsed by celebrity gossip and economic forecasts. Ben, however, saw the subtle movements of the chess pieces, the sudden, inexplicable global recession, the desperate call for private companies to develop space platforms, the rise of the Church of the Dying Earth, and the hushed talk of population control that filtered through his network. He knew that the GPI's media strategy, which was meant to quell fear, was ironically fueling the very paranoia it was designed to contain. By leaking small, unverified tidbits, the GPI was attempting to placate powerful news agencies that wanted a seat at the table of survival. It was a risky game. It was a game built on a house of cards, and Ben, with his access to the unfiltered data, was watching the whole thing begin to sway in the wind. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Neptune falling, Chapter 3, The Corporate Gambit. Marcus Thorne surveyed the room. A glass palace of steel and glass perched on the 55th floor of a skyscraper in Dubai. This was the headquarters of the think tank, a private consortium of the world's most influential and wealthy families. They were the ones who saw the coming catastrophe not as an end, but as a market opportunity. And Marcus Thorne, a man who believed the only true power lay in information and capital, was their architect. They're spending trillions, Thorne said, his voice a low, gravelly hum, referring to the GPI, on a public-private partnership that is so laughably inefficient, it will fail before it even begins. They're trying to save everyone, and in doing so they'll save no one. Across from him sat 4 figures, each representing a different global dynasty. A Saudi oil baron, a Chinese tech mogul, a German industrialist, and a South American mining magnate. They were the ones who had funded the think tank, who saw the GPI as a foolish, democratic experiment. They wanted a solution, but a solution for them and their interests alone. "We have the capital," said the tech mogul, a woman in a crisp white suit named Letian. "But they have the public's ear. They are building a narrative of global cooperation, a lie we cannot directly contradict." "We won't," Thorne replied with a smile. "We will create a counter-narrative, one built on competition and merit. We will leverage their own asteroid cover story. We'll present our own prize, a global competition, open to all private companies, to build a self-sustaining Mars colony." The group was silent for a moment, absorbing the audacity of the plan. "The size of the prize," Thorne continued, "will be in the hundreds of millions. A reward so massive it will drive the most brilliant minds away from the GPI and into our private sector. We will find a solution for ourselves, and the world will have to decide which narrative they want to believe." Marcus Thorne's past is a rags-to-riches story twisted by a ruthless desire for recognition and control. He grew up in a world that saw him as invisible and inconsequential. He was driven by a single goal, to prove that he was not only worthy of success, but that he was better than the systems that had once held him back. His entire life has been a game of strategy, and he sees the GPI's mission as just another system to exploit for his own gain. The competition was a masterstroke of psychological warfare. The prize money, while immense, was a fraction of what the GPI was spending, yet it captured the imagination. It turned a looming catastrophe into a sporting event. Private companies, from struggling startups to established aerospace giants, scrambled to put together proposals. They weren't just competing for money. They were competing for a seat on the last boat off the sinking ship. The prize was more than just a check. It was a promise of survival. This move created a parallel stream of space exploration, a mirror image of the GPI's mission but funded by greed rather than salvation. The news of the competition, which Thorne and his group strategically leaked to the press, was met with a mix of outrage and excitement. The public was confused. Were they facing a global threat or a technological challenge? Was the GPI a force for good? Or was it a bloated bureaucracy that was failing to address the problem? As the corporate race to Mars began, the GPI was forced to react. They publicly condemned the think tank's prize, calling it a selfish, misguided endeavor. But their words felt hollow. The public was already captivated by the high-stakes contest, and the GPI, despite all its power, was quickly losing control of the narrative. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Neptune Falling, Chapter 4, The Anthropologists. Dr. Kaylin Reed stared at the screen, a chilling fascination in her eyes. The data wasn't in spreadsheets or graphs, but in a series of live, anonymized video feeds. She watched a small farming community in rural India, a fishing village in Senegal, and a bustling urban block in Argentina. The GPI had provided her with the tools for what they called global societal monitoring, a network of hidden cameras and microphones designed to capture a microcosm of human behavior. Her job was to analyze how different cultures were reacting to the subtle, slow, building signs of the global crisis. The food shortages, the disappearing social services, the general air of decay. Kaylin's training as a radical anthropologist had taught her to look for patterns beyond the obvious. While the GPI was focused on what people were doing, rioting, protesting, hoarding, she was focused on why. She saw the Indian farmers forming new, decentralized trading networks to bypass the collapsing government supply chains. She watched the Senegalese fishermen returning to ancient, communal bartering systems. In Argentina, the urban block, long atomized by modern life, was rediscovering neighborly bonds, sharing food and resources to survive. They weren't just reacting, they were adapting. They weren't waiting to be saved by a centralized authority. They were saving themselves. She compiled her findings into reports that she submitted to Director Sharma. Her conclusions were always the same. Humanity, when left to its own devices, was incredibly resilient and innovative. The solutions to the world's problems were not coming from the top down, but from the bottom up, through ancient social structures and new, fluid alliances. She believed her research was a beacon of hope, a counterpoint to the GPI's rigid, top-down approach. But with each report, Kaylin noticed a growing disconnect. Sharma would nod, praise her work, and ask for more detail on at-risk communities and their adaptive strategies. Kaylin felt a cold dread settle in her stomach as she began to see the truth. The GPI wasn't using her research to save these communities. They were studying them for a more sinister purpose. They weren't trying to understand resilience. They were trying to understand how to control chaos. They weren't looking for solutions. They were looking for weaknesses. The GPI, with its godlike authority, wasn't interested in the people who could save themselves. They were interested in who was worth saving and who wasn't. Kalen's mission, which she had naively believed was about preserving humanity's spirit, was really about helping a select few decide who would live and who would die. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Neptune Falling, Chapter 5, A Great Private Race. The GPI's carefully crafted plans for a unified, global effort were not being undone by protests or outright rebellion. They were being undone by spreadsheets. A GPI liaison, a weary man named David, who had once been a procurement officer, sat in the sterile, white conference room of a major aerospace company. He had a simple offer: a government contract to build components for the Mars colony. It was a standard, if accelerated, proposal. The company's CEO, a woman with a sharp, unsettling smile, leaned back in her chair. David, your offer is generous, truly, but it's also a 5-year contract with a series of performance metrics and government oversight. We have a better deal on the table. David didn't have to ask from whom. The announcement of the think tank's prize had sent shockwaves through the corporate world. Billions of dollars were being dangled in front of private enterprises to be the first to build a truly self-sustaining private space platform for the world's elite. It was a winner-take-all competition, a race to build a modern-day Noah's Ark for the highest bidder. That prize is a distraction, David said, his voice flat. It's a publicity stunt. The GPI is the only one with the resources and political will to see this through. The CEO's smile widened, revealing a set of perfectly white teeth. Is it? The GPI offers a contract, the think tank offers a prize. A prize that allows us to own the technology. A prize that makes us a new kind of government. It's not about saving the world, David. It's about owning the piece of it that survives. She tapped a button on the table, and the door to the room opened behind him. We're going to have to decline your offer. As David walked back to his car, he felt a wave of despair. It wasn't just this company. Reports were pouring in from all over the world. The same thing was happening with every major space and engineering firm. The GPI was hemorrhaging talent and resources, all because a few wealthy men had managed to turn humanity's survival into the ultimate corporate game. The world was at a precipice, and the most powerful people on it were more concerned with winning than with simply living. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Neptune Falling, Chapter 6, The Unseen Hand. In the months following Marcus Thorne's announcement, the world's most powerful corporations were scrambling. The promise of the prize was a siren song, and the race to build a Mars platform became a public spectacle of televised launches and press conferences. But in a fortified abandoned missile silo in the American Midwest, Dr. Evelyn Hayes and General Silas Stone Harding watched the circus with detached amusement. They had no rockets, no corporate backing, and no intention of building a colony. They had a strategy. They're all chasing the wrong problem, Hayes said, her eyes fixed on a screen displaying schematics for a rival company's launch vehicle. It's not about who gets there first. It's about who can stay there. Power, air, water, they're all tied to a single elegant solution. Harding, ever the tactician, used his old Black Ops network to gather intelligence. His contacts, disillusioned and operating on the fringes of the global collapse, provided a constant stream of information. He learned which companies were working together, where their weaknesses were, and which technologies they were pursuing. He found that all of them, from the aerospace giants to the tech titans, were focused on scaling up existing, inefficient technologies. They were trying to solve the problem with brute force and endless resources. Hayes and Harding had a better idea. Their proposal, submitted under the name of a shell company created by one of Harding's proxies, was a single, 30-page document. It was not a blueprint for a base but for a core component, a self-sustaining, closed-loop matter-antimatter reactor. The document argued that no amount of solar panels or imported fusion fuel could power a long-term colony. The only viable path was a zero-waste, perpetual energy source. Their plan didn't promise a complete colony. It promised the single most crucial piece of the puzzle. They didn't need to win the whole race, just the most critical part of it. For the final pitch, Harding's proxy, a former accountant, used a secure, untraceable video call. He presented a small, functioning prototype the size of a lunchbox. It generated enough power to run a small apartment indefinitely. The proxy delivered the message with a practiced coldness. This isn't just a solution for Mars. It's a solution for the future. The prize money will go towards scaling it up. Marcus Thorne, intrigued by the unique, understated approach, had his own team vet the proposal. They couldn't find a single flaw in the physics. More importantly, they couldn't find the creators. The prize was given to the Ghost Company. It was a victory won not with rockets and grand announcements but with intelligence and a ruthless understanding of the real problem. The money, A fortune in a collapsing world provided Hayes and Harding with everything they needed to pursue their own, far more radical agenda. The Global Phoenix Initiative Chapter 7, The Scientific Gambit. The sterile, white walls of the CERN particle accelerator now buzzed with a purpose far beyond the pursuit of fundamental physics. It was a place of frantic, desperate hope. Scientists from every nation, once rivals, now worked as a single, exhausted unit. Their new goal: to devise a matter-antimatter tractor beam large enough to tug a gas giant out of its doomsday orbit. Dr. Eris Thorne, a theoretical physicist whose work had once been considered too abstract for practical application, was now the reluctant commander of this scientific army. He stood before a massive holographic display of Neptune's trajectory, tracing the vectors with a trembling finger. "The numbers are impossible," he muttered to his team. "The power required to counteract Neptune's mass is astronomical. We'd need to generate and control an antimatter field that defies every known principle of containment." His partner, Dr. Lena Petrova, a stoic Russian engineer, pointed to a new schematic. "We are no longer bound by known principles, Eris. The GPI has given us full access. We're developing a quantum confinement system using exotic materials. The theory holds that, with a sustained energy flow from a solar array of unprecedented scale, we could generate a stable beam capable of a precise, low-impact gravitational pull." The words sounded like a prayer. They were a language only a few hundred people on the planet could truly understand, a final gamble by a species that had run out of easy options. They weren't just building a machine. They were building a new law of physics, one that might save them all. Outside the lab's secure, soundproof walls, the world was descending into chaos, but inside they found a strange sort of peace. This was the work they were born to do. This was the only thing that mattered. With every calculation, every failed test, and every new theory, they were not just trying to move a planet. They were trying to give humanity a new reason to hope. The GPI had made its choices, but these scientists were the ones trying to find a way to make them stick. Their success or failure would decide the fate of billions. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 8, The Phase Shift Drive. In a decommissioned missile silo in the American Midwest, far from the prying eyes of the GPI, the impossible was taking shape. For years, the official scientific community had struggled with the matter-antimatter beam, a monumental failure of physics and engineering. But where the GPI's labs saw an insurmountable problem, two people saw an elegant solution born of necessity. Dr. Evelyn Hayes, with her razor-sharp mind for theoretical physics, and General Silas Stone Harding, with his brutal practicality and experience with covert operations, had forged an unlikely partnership. "The GPI is trying to push a mountain with a stick," Evelyn Harding had grumbled one night, watching a news report about the latest matter-antimatter beam failure. "What's our move?" Evelyn's answer was a concept so radical it had been dismissed by the mainstream scientific community as fantasy: the phase shift drive. The idea was simple, yet terrifyingly complex. Instead of moving Neptune, they would momentarily move the Earth. By creating a localized artificial pocket of space-time, they could displace the planet by a few million kilometers, just enough for Neptune to pass harmlessly by. It was not propulsion, it was a cosmic sidestep, working in secret, funded by the think tank's prize money, and the stolen resources from the Odyssey 2, they built their prototype. It was a chaotic mix of military surplus and bleeding-edge quantum technology, all meticulously wired together by a skeleton crew of engineers who shared their anti-establishment zeal. The device itself was a monstrosity of supercooled magnets, quantum generators, and a core powered by a captured, contained matter-antimatter reaction. The day of the test was a moment of profound silence. Their target, a discarded military satellite in low Earth orbit. The drive hummed to life with a deep, unsettling thrum. For a moment, the air crackled with energy, and then, without a sound, the satellite was simply gone. It had not been destroyed or pushed away. It had shifted, occupying a new point in space a few miles from its original position. The test was a success. Silas and Evelyn looked at each other, the same thought passing between them without words. They had done what the world's combined governments and scientists couldn't. They had not just found a solution, they had proven that the old systems were broken, and that a new world, one where a small, dedicated few could save the many, was possible. They had just bought humanity a little more time, on their own terms. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 9, The Quiet Collapse. In the years that followed the GPI's formation, the world didn't end with a bang, but with a series of quiet, devastating whimpers. It began subtly, with the closure of community centers and libraries, framed as necessary budget cuts in a post-recession world. Then came the whispers, growing louder with each passing month: a school system here, a hospital wing there, shuddering without a clear explanation. Social programs that had been the bedrock of modern society for decades simply vanished, their funding diverted into black holes in the global budget. The effect was a slow, grinding societal breakdown. Small-scale protests erupted, not against a single enemy, but against the very air of stagnation and decay. People lost their homes, their jobs, and their hope. With no clear culprit, their frustration metastasized into suspicion. Online forums and local tabloids exploded with theories. Was it a coordinated effort by the wealthy elite to consolidate power, a foreign plot to weaken the world's nations from within? The asteroid story was so bland, so unnewsworthy, that it only fueled the fire, proving to the paranoid that the governments were hiding something far more sinister. In the streets of 100 cities, from New Delhi to New York, the unrest became a new kind of normal. Riots over food shortages and job losses were a nightly occurrence, requiring a constant presence of riot police. Governments, already strained by the monumental cost of the GPI's projects, were bleeding resources to maintain order. The people were a pressure cooker, and the GPI, in their quiet, desperate race to the stars, had turned up the heat, oblivious to the fact that they were pushing the lid to its breaking point. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 10, A Doctrine of Triage. Director Anya Sharma stared at the holographic display, the cool blue light doing nothing to hide the grim reality presented by the data. The numbers were irrefutable. The charts showed a steep, sickening decline in available resources, and a talent drain that mirrored the flow of a failing hourglass. The corporate race, as innocuous as it sounded, was a hemorrhage of human potential. Her chief engineer, a man with haunted eyes who had spent the last 6 months trying to secure a single, critical fusion welder, finally spoke. "It's just not viable, Director. We ran the numbers. Again, the corporate contracts have siphoned off nearly 80% of our top engineers and a similar amount of our materials. The Mars colony was a plan designed for a unified world. This is not a unified world. We'd be lucky to build a small research outpost, let alone an ark for millions." The head of logistics, a veteran military officer, grunted in agreement. "We'd save maybe 100,000. At best, the resources and manpower required to get 1 million people to Mars are simply not there. The private sector is cannibalizing us." Silence filled the room, heavy and suffocating. The grand, ambitious plan, the one that had captured the public's imagination and served as the cornerstone of the GPI's cover story, was a fantasy. Anya closed her eyes. The dream of 1 million citizens building a new future on the Red Planet, a future she had publicly promised, was dead. She had to make the call. She had to choose who would live and where. "Then we change the plan," she said, her voice low but steady. "We shift the priority to the orbital pods. The design is less resource-intensive, and the build-out is simpler. We focus on that, and we make a secondary push on the nuclear fleet. The Mars colony is no longer viable. The GPI will now focus on a smaller, more contained solution for a select few." She looked at her team, their faces a mix of relief and profound grief. They were no longer the saviors of humanity. They were its tree-edge doctors. The dream of a new home on Mars was over, and the race for survival had just gotten infinitely smaller. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 11, A New Hope. Dr. Kalen Reed's office wasn't an office at all. It was a sterile, soundproof pod tucked away in a sub-basement of the Global Phoenix Initiative's secure headquarters. Her only windows were screens, which displayed not landscapes, but data streams. These were her research subjects, not ancient civilizations, but contemporary ones, the ones deemed unsavable. Her new title was lead anthropologist of Project Phoenix. Her real job was to quantify despair. She studied the rising tide of conspiracy theories, the birth of radical militias, and the sudden, overwhelming popularity of the Church of the Dying Earth. The GPI had given her access to an unprecedented level of surveillance data, from social media trends to satellite imagery of unsanctioned gatherings. Kalen reviewed a video feed from a hidden drone. It showed a makeshift tent city on the outskirts of what was once a prosperous city. A place where people lived in the absence of a future. They were the ones left behind by the GPI's Mars and orbital pod programs. The official story was that an asteroid was coming, and they were the ones who had lost hope. But Kalen knew the truth. They were not without hope. They were the ones who had found a new kind of hope. She studied their rituals, the way they organized their communities, the stories they told around their campfires, the leaders who rose to power. She saw the same patterns she had documented in societies facing famine, plague, or conquest. The human spirit, when stripped of its material trappings, turned inward. It sought solace in faith, in community, in a shared narrative, no matter how bleak. Kalen was a scientist, but the data was beginning to change her. It wasn't just numbers and trends. It was a story of a world in pain. She saw the Church of the Dying Earth not as a threat, but as a spiritual response to a scientific apocalypse. She saw the militias not as criminals, but as a population-level immune response, a desperate, disorganized attempt to fight a problem no one was willing to admit was real. Her research was meant to help the GPI predict and mitigate the social unrest caused by their actions, but Kaelin began to suspect that her findings were being used for a different purpose entirely. The raw data on the tent cities was being used to track and control them, not to understand them. The information on the militias was being used to predict and preempt their movements, not to integrate them. She looked at a diagram on her screen that showed a direct correlation between social unrest and a decrease in funding for GPI projects. The more people complained, the more money was diverted to placate them. This was a war for resources, and Kaelin was a silent observer, watching the faction of humanity battle for a future that only a lucky few would be a part of. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 13, The Great Religious Accord. The ancient stone walls of the Benedictine monastery in Italy, a fortress against time, and a repository of knowledge now played host to a different kind of negotiation. Inside, a hushed, private chamber held a summit of faith. The leader of the Church of the Dying Earth sat opposite the Cardinal of the Vatican, an aged man who represented billions of souls. The table was simple, a slab of dark wood, and on it sat a single, flickering candle. "Your Eminence," the church leader began, his voice calm and melodic, "the signs are clear. This is not a man-made event to be solved with more human ingenuity. This is the hand of a creator. We have seen the GPI's plans fail one after another, a Mars colony for the few, weapons that may only worsen our fate. The people are not looking for a savior from a government that has already lost their trust. They are looking for a reason to accept the inevitable." The Cardinal, his face a roadmap of a life spent in diplomacy, considered the words. His church had always taught of hope, of salvation, but the sheer scale of the coming doom had shaken the foundations of every faith. For every sermon of hope, there was a quiet, gnawing fear in the pews. The idea of divine judgment, of a final act of creation and destruction, was not new to his theology. "What you are proposing," the Cardinal said, "is not a faith of salvation. It is a faith of surrender. It is a faith of acceptance." The church leader countered, "The same acceptance that a man feels in the final moments of his life, when he sees all his struggles were for naught. We offer peace. We offer purpose in the end. We offer a united front against a world that has already chosen to abandon its own soul in a desperate, failed attempt to survive." Across the globe, similar conversations were taking place. In a mosque in Istanbul, an imam quietly debated with a firebrand preacher from the church. In a temple in India, a respected guru listened to the cosmic theories of the new faith, finding parallels in ancient texts. The GPI's failures had created a vacuum of faith. The official, secular narrative was losing its power, and the people were looking for an alternative. A week later, the first joint public statement was released. It was signed by the leaders of dozens of major faiths, not just fringe groups. The accord did not condemn the GPI's efforts outright, but it called on all believers to trust in the natural order of all things and to embrace a final peace, rather than a final war against destiny. It was a subtle, yet devastating, blow to the GPI's credibility. It wasn't just a handful of rebels. It was a movement of billions. The religious leaders had not only found a common ground, they had taken a unified stance against the architects of a future they no longer believed in. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 14, Ruthless Efficiency. In the sterile, windowless conference rooms of the world's most powerful governments, the discussion was never about if, but how. The official GPI reports had been circulated, and the math was grim and unyielding. The Mars base and the orbital pods could, at best, accommodate a few million. The population of Earth was in the billions. A horrific but logical conclusion was reached. Triage was not an option, it was a necessity. The meetings were a testament to cold, clinical cruelty. National leaders, generals, and intelligence chiefs sat around mahogany tables, discussing human lives with the dispassion of corporate mergers. The strategy was to use existing infrastructure to achieve the desired outcome, a chillingly efficient plan that would leave no fingerprints. In India, a top-secret directive was passed down to the Ministry of Health, under the guise of a nationwide vaccination program for a new, highly contagious flu strain. A synthetic pathogen was to be distributed. It was a virus designed to be asymptomatic in children and the elderly, but to trigger fatal, untreatable pneumonia in adults between the ages of 18 and 60. The logic was simple. Save the young to carry the torch and the old to pass on wisdom. In China, the program was a combination of economic and environmental policy. A new set of green initiatives was rolled out, targeting polluting factories and agricultural zones in densely populated areas. The government's public position was a commitment to a healthier future, but in secret, The closure of these facilities was a death sentence. The resulting mass starvation and lack of sanitation, particularly in the poorer provinces, would lead to a rapid population decline. In the United States, a more subtle and insidious plan was put into motion. The government partnered with major pharmaceutical companies to introduce a new, widely available fertility aid marketed to young couples. The pill was a masterstroke of deception. It would increase the chance of conception for the first 6 months, but its long-term use would cause irreversible infertility. The aim was to dramatically reduce the number of new births, ensuring that the next generation would be small enough to fit on the Mars platforms. Each nation's plan was meticulously crafted to ensure their own survival. The actions were justified under the banner of preserving their respective cultures and peoples. The human cost was simply a line item in a ledger, a necessary evil in the face of certain extinction. They were not evil men, at least not in their own eyes. They were simply survivors. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 15, The Great Culling. The sterile, circular conference room felt smaller than usual, suffocating under the weight of a grim new reality. Director Anya Sharma sat at the head of the table, her face a mask of weary professionalism, but her eyes betrayed a growing horror. Around her, the representatives of the United States, Russia, China, India, and England sat in stunned silence. The data had come in from a joint intelligence operation, a quiet, almost casual report tucked into the regular daily briefings, but its content was anything but casual. Confirmed. Based on satellite imagery and communication intercepts, reported the U.S. delegate, a stoic woman with a military background. 2 separate and distinct population control campaigns. One in Southeast Asia, another in Sub-Saharan Africa, covertly funded, disguised as public health initiatives. Accelerated by a manufactured economic downturn in key sectors. The silence in the room was thick with unspoken question. The delegate from England, a man named Alistair Finch, was the first to speak. His voice was a strained whisper. Population control. What does that even mean? It means they're not trying to save their people, Anya said, her voice cutting through the tension. They're trying to reduce the number of mouths to feed, to make their portion of the Mars colony more viable for the chosen few when the time comes. A new fault line had just opened up within the GPI. The organization was built on a foundation of global cooperation. But this new information shattered that illusion. The Russian delegate, General Volkov, was the most pragmatic. We are all taking difficult steps. This is simply a more direct approach. They are ensuring the survival of their people by any means necessary. By culling the excess? Finch shot back, his face pale with disgust. This is not an organization for survival. It's a global death panel. The Chinese representative, Li Feng, said impassively, "The resources are finite. You speak of morality from a position of privilege. We do not have the luxury of a large public relations campaign for a Mars colony. We have millions of people who need to be managed." The meeting devolved into a heated argument. The moral compass of the GPI was spinning wildly. For the first time, the leaders were not just fighting a distant, celestial enemy. They were fighting each other. The covert actions of a few nations had exposed a deep, ideological chasm. The GPI was no longer a unified front. It was a collection of desperate nations, each with its own agenda and its own definition of survival. The race to save humanity had turned into a brutal, unspoken war for who deserved to be saved. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 16, The Unsanctioned. The dilapidated warehouse smelled of rust and desperation. It was a far cry from the GPI's sterile conference rooms, or the think tank's glass-walled offices. Here, in the forgotten industrial district of a city left behind, an unlikely alliance was being forged. On one side stood General Silas Stone Harding, a former Special Forces commander who had been discharged for insubordination. He led a network of militias, groups of survivalists and veterans who had seen the government's plans as a betrayal. They had weapons, training, and a profound distrust of authority. Facing him was Dr. Evelyn Hayes, a theoretical physicist who had been blacklisted by the GPI for her radical high-risk theories on quantum propulsion. She represented a collective of independent thinkers, engineers, and scientists who had been excluded from the global projects. They had the ideas and the intellect, but lacked the resources and the political clout to be heard. Evelyn and Silas's shared history is one of betrayal at the hands of their government. They were part of a classified military science operation that went wrong due to bureaucratic incompetence and a desire to cut costs. The mission's failure was covered up, and they were scapegoated and discharged. This shared sense of injustice forged an unbreakable bond and a deep distrust of all official institutions. They believed that if anything is going to save humanity, it won't be from the top down, but from the bottom up. "You have the muscle," Evelyn said, her voice clear and precise despite the cavernous space. "We have the brains. The GPI has both, and they've used them to decide who lives and who dies. We are not a part of their plan, so we will make our own." Silas grunted in agreement. They're building their ark to escape, not to save everyone. Our people have been training for an apocalypse. We just didn't think it would be so exclusive. Their plan was audacious, bordering on insane. Evelyn's theories centered on a phase shift drive, a concept that could, in theory, alter an object's mass and trajectory for a brief, calculated moment. It was a direct counter to the GPI's brute force approach of nuclear explosions and tractor beams. But without a vessel to test it on, it was just a theory. Their solution, they would steal one. Their target was a GPI supply vessel. A mid-sized freighter currently in orbit, scheduled to be decommissioned in a few months. It was lightly defended, and its schematics were publicly available to an extent. Silas's people would find a way to get a team to the vessel, and Evelyn's team would use a repurposed military satellite to hack its navigation and power systems. The ultimate goal was not to use the ship to escape, but to turn it into a floating weapon, a final, unsanctioned effort to nudge Neptune's orbit just enough to make a difference. This was a high-stakes gamble with a slim chance of success. But for the people in that warehouse, it was their only chance. They were a coalition of the unwanted, a desperate faction fighting not for a place on the Ark but for a chance to stop the flood. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 17, The Odyssey II. The GPI freighter, the Odyssey II, was a lumbering metal whale in the sky, a symbol of the world's last hope. It was carrying a precious cargo of quantum confinement coils and exotic materials, the final components needed for the matter-antimatter beam. Its flight path was a classified secret, a journey from a secure fabrication facility in the Sahara to the CERN Command Center in Switzerland. But not all secrets remained buried. General Silas Stone Harding, a name whispered in the halls of Power 4, his legendary tactical mind, watched its progress from a converted Cold War-era bunker in the Ural Mountains. His partner, Dr. Evelyn Hayes, sat beside him, surrounded by a mess of wires and salvage technology. They had been betrayed by the system once, and now they were going to prove that the system was fundamentally flawed. "It's on approach," Evelyn said, her voice tight with anticipation. "They've disabled all civilian air traffic in the corridor," Harding said, a grim smile on his face. "They think we're a nation-state. They don't realize we're just a few dozen people with better toys." Their toys were a testament to their unorthodox alliance. A salvaged S-400 missile launcher, a converted commercial jet that had been stripped down and re-engineered, and a network of black-market jammers and transponders that could mimic GPI-issued codes. As the Odyssey II began its final descent, a wave of digital noise hit its control systems. The transponders on the ground began broadcasting an emergency code, a fake signal from a non-existent GPI-certified landing zone. The pilot, confused and unable to get a clear signal from headquarters, was forced to divert. "They're taking the bait," Evelyn said, her eyes fixed on the screen. The freighter banked sharply and began to descend into a remote, forgotten airfield. As its landing gear touched the worn asphalt, Harding's forces swarmed it. The operation was swift and brutal. The guards were neutralized by a quick-acting neurotoxin, and the cargo bay was breached. The coils, the most valuable items on Earth, were loaded onto modified transport planes. Back in the bunker, Harding looked at Evelyn. "The GPI will be in disarray," he said. "They've lost their last chance to get their little toy to work. Now, they'll have no choice but to listen to what we found." The theft was a direct shot across the bow of the GPI. It wasn't just a loss of equipment. It was a loss of control, a public and humiliating demonstration that the world's most powerful organization was no longer omnipotent. A new player had entered the game, and they were playing by their own rules. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 18, The Ghost in the Machine. For years, Ben Carter had been the ghost in the machine. He moved through the GPI's data network like a shadow, unnoticed by the firewalls and unnoticed by the people who populated the server rooms. He wasn't looking to steal secrets. He was looking for the truth. He'd seen the numbers on the budget sheets that didn't add up, the odd directives, the astronomical spending on seemingly innocuous projects. It was a digital breadcrumb trail left by a lie of cosmic proportions. His break came from a defunct telescope, array in the Australian outback, a system so old and forgotten that its data logs were considered junk. Sifting through years of corrupted packets and corrupted files, he found it. A single, unredacted report from a low-level scientist that had been misfiled and forgotten. It was a log of the black hole's initial entry into the solar system, gravitational pull that had shifted Triton, and the cascading event that had put Neptune on a collision course with Earth. Ben stared at the screen for hours, the cool glow illuminating his face. The data was raw, horrifying, and utterly undeniable. The GPI wasn't just managing an asteroid. They were managing the end of the world. They were keeping a secret that would condemn billions. He thought of his past, the stories that were killed, the evidence that was buried. This lie was too big to bury. He didn't have a plan. He wasn't a hero. He was just a man with a modem and a conscience. He spent a sleepless night, compressing the data into a single, encrypted file. He then used a series of secure, anonymous digital drops to upload it. He didn't send it to the GPI's headquarters, or to the government he no longer trusted. Instead, he sent it to a dozen independent news agencies, to a handful of influential bloggers, and to a few private think tanks he knew were already sniffing around for information. He had no idea if anyone would even find the file, let alone understand it. He had done all he could. The rest was up to them. The next morning, a small, independent online news agency in Helsinki, in the business section, ran a small headline. GPI budget discrepancies linked to possible unknown celestial event. The story was picked up by a larger, more aggressive investigative outlet in London, then another in Tokyo within hours. The simple, undeniable data Ben had released went viral. The cover story about the asteroid, flimsy to begin with, was now a tattered piece of paper in a hurricane. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 19, The Quantum Leap. Director Anya Sharma stood in the briefing room, a cold knot in her stomach. The grainy satellite footage of the Odyssey 2 being rated played on a loop, a public and humiliating demonstration of the GPI's vulnerability. Her head of security's voice was a low hum in her ear, detailing the swift, professional nature of the heist. They had lost the most critical components for the matter-antimatter beam, the only true hope left. They have what they want, she said, cutting him off. And now they have our attention. What matters now is what we do without it. She immediately convened an emergency session with Dr. Eris Thorne and his team. The air in the room was thick with despair. The months of work, the billions of dollars, the countless hours all stolen in a matter of minutes. But Anya wasn't there to mourn. She was there to rebuild. The coils are gone. That means we have a choice. Give up. Or find a better way, she stated, her voice calm and resolute. You were using the coils as a crutch, a containment system, for a field you couldn't stabilize. What if you didn't need them? The idea was audacious, almost heretical. Eris stared at her, his mind racing. The stolen hardware had been a limitation, forcing their hand. Stripped of the crutch, they were forced to innovate. Eris began to theorize, his hands moving through the air as he scribbled on a digital whiteboard. What if the massive solar arrays they were building could be used to do more than just power the beam? What if they could be used to focus the energy itself, creating a contained antimatter field without any physical hardware? The team worked with a feverish intensity they hadn't known since the project's inception. They were not just rebuilding, they were reinventing. They redesigned the entire architecture of the beam, shifting the focus from physical components to pure, concentrated energy. The theft had, in a strange twist of fate, liberated them from the constraints of their initial design. Weeks later, in a remote testing facility, the new prototype was ready. With a command, the solar arrays turned and began to channel light, a silent river of energy pouring into the heart of the newly designed accelerator. A low hum filled the air, rising in pitch until it became a pure, resonant tone. In the center of the chamber, a tiny, self-contained sphere of pure anti-matter began to glow, held in place by an invisible, humming field. The test was a success. As the globe descended into chaos and the cover story began to crumble, the GPI had just taken its first quantum leap. The world outside was spiraling, but deep within the Earth's most secure facility, the fate of humanity was being rewritten. Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 20, Breaking the Silence. Ben Carter's routine was interrupted by a jolt. His multi-monitor setup, usually a quiet mosaic of data streams and news tickers, began to flicker with urgent red banners. His news feed, which had for years dutifully relegated the asteroid story to page 32, suddenly exploded. A major international news network, one with a parent company that had been denied a seat at the GPI table, had just run a bombshell report. The headline was simple, devastating, and impossible to ignore. GPI cover-up. It's not an asteroid. The report, a meticulously sourced deep dive into satellite data and leaked internal memos, exposed the entire truth. They showed the initial footage of the black hole, the orbital pull on Triton, and the catastrophic collision with Neptune. It was the story Ben had been chasing for years, laid bare for the world to see. The dam had broken. Within minutes, every major news outlet followed suit. The quiet conspiracy theorists who had been shouting into the void were suddenly validated. The official GPI website, which had long spouted vague mission statements about planetary defense, was now a digital war zone of accusations and denials. The stock markets, already fragile from the social program diversions, collapsed. The red banners turned to green as the trading floor went dark, a final act of surrender. The chaos was instant and visceral. On the streets, the polite veneer of society cracked. Video feeds showed people abandoning their cars in the middle of highways, rushing to hoard supplies. Riots erupted in major cities as the public, feeling betrayed and abandoned, lashed out at anything that represented the system that had lied to them. The GPI's carefully crafted facade had not only failed but had also created a global mass hysteria far worse than what they had initially feared. At GPI headquarters, Director Anya Sharma watched the chaos on a wall of monitors. The room was no longer filled with the quiet hum of data processing. It was a cacophony of panicked voices and flashing alerts. The GPI had tried to control the story, but the narrative had become a currency, a bargaining chip in a new kind of global game. News agencies, sensing their impending doom, had leveraged their power for a chance at survival. They had been denied a seat on the Ark, and in return, they had set fire to the world they were all about to leave behind. Anya closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a path through the exhaustion on her face. The irony was not lost on her. For years, they had been preparing to fight a celestial object, to beat a planet into submission, but they had not prepared for the most unpredictable and dangerous variable of all, humanity itself. The collision with Neptune was 3 years away, but the world was already in a state of self-destruction. The GPI's mission was now not just to save a fraction of humanity, but to simply survive the panic of the rest. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 21, The Last Stand. The final countdown was not on a screen, but in the ragged breath of humanity. The world had descended into a controlled chaos, a global nervous breakdown managed by armed forces. At the Global Phoenix Initiative's launch facility, Director Anya Sharma stood in a reinforced command center, the air thick with the stench of ozone and sweat. They were launching the nuclear-armed hammer ships, the last resort to nudge Neptune off course. The mission was a calculated gamble, the result of 2 decades of work, and it felt impossibly fragile. On the main screen, a live feed showed the launch pad. The ships, colossal and elegant in their terrifying purpose, stood ready. Outside the blast walls, a frantic mob of protesters and looters had to be held back by armed guards. The sound of their despair was a constant, low roar, a grim soundtrack to the world's last hope. Across the globe, in the vast expanse of the Gobi Desert, Marcus Thorne watched from the panoramic window of his private shuttle. Below, the final Mars transport, a titan of polished steel, was preparing for liftoff. The boarding was a savage affair. Armed security forces kept the desperate masses at bay while the world's wealthiest, many of them unrecognizable in their haste and fear, scrambled aboard. The luxury he had promised them was a lie. This was a cramped, utilitarian coffin, but it was their ticket to a new beginning. All aboard, his chief of security announced. Final manifest is complete. Marcus smiled, a cold, empty gesture. The GPI could have their grand, heroic gesture. He had his own, the quiet, calculated survival of the few who had the foresight and the money to pay for it. He watched the last of the cargo pods being loaded, his eyes fixated not on the people, but on the prize. Meanwhile, in a clandestine orbital laboratory powered by stolen GPI schematics, the unsanctioned solution was in full swing. Dr. Evelyn Hayes, her hands trembling with a mixture of terror and exhilaration, worked a control panel, phase shift drive engaged. She announced to General Silas Stone Harding. Their stolen freighter, now a makeshift weapon, shimmered as the experimental drive pulsed with an unstable, otherworldly light. Final checks on targeting. Silas's voice crackled over the comms. We get one shot at this. We either pull it off, or we become the biggest cosmic firecracker in history. Their plan was to use the phase shift, jump into Neptune's path, then deploy a small payload of explosives, a tiny shove that could, in theory, save the world. It was insane, dangerous, and brilliantly desperate. And in a quiet, isolated lab high in the Swiss Alps, a different kind of weapon was coming online. The matter-antimatter tractor beam, a beautiful and complex piece of engineering, word to life. It wasn't meant to push Neptune. It was meant to give the hammer ships a better target. The lead scientist, a veteran of the project from the very beginning, wiped a tear from his eye as the beam powered up. It was beautiful. A fragile, elegant hope, humming with the promise of a future that felt a little less impossible. All these moments, all these final pushes, were happening at once. The loud desperation of the launches, the quiet terror of the escapes, the silent prayer of the scientists. 20 years of work, of secrets, of betrayal, and of sacrifice had all led to this single, pivotal moment. The world held its breath, waiting for the first action to be taken, for the final act to begin. The Global Phoenix Initiative, Chapter 22, The Reckoning. The seconds stretched into an eternity. Director Anya Sharma watched the data stream on the main screen at GPI headquarters, a single point of light on a vast, star-strewn canvas. The hammer ships had detonated precisely as calculated, the colossal bursts of light visible even from Earth's orbit. The matter-antimatter beam from the Swiss Alps had held true, creating a pinpoint of incredible instability on Neptune's surface for the bombs to target. Now, all that was left was to wait for the gravitational data. The initial numbers were inconclusive, a blur of noise and chaos. In the Gobi Desert, The Mars transport had successfully lifted off. Marcus Thorne looked down at the rapidly shrinking Earth, a sense of detached accomplishment washing over him. The world he had left behind was a testament to his foresight, and its survival was no longer his concern. He had won the game. He settled back into his seat, a cold, empty smile on his face, ready for the journey to a new, exclusive future. In the stolen orbital lab, Dr. Evelyn Hayes and General Silas Stone Harding felt the violent jolt of the phase shift drive engaging and disengaging. Their small ship, a tiny vessel of defiant hope, had made its jump, deployed its payload, and then jumped back out of the way just as Neptune's immense gravitational pull threatened to tear it apart. They stared at a single, blinking red light on their control panel. It was a simple diagnostic. Payload successfully deployed. They had no way of knowing if it had made a difference, only that they had done their part. They had chosen to fight for a world that had abandoned them, and their success, or their demise, was now in the hands of the cosmos. Meanwhile, on the ground, the leader of the Church of the Dying Earth stood before a massive crowd. His sermon was nearing its climax. A final, beautiful plea for peace and acceptance in the face of the inevitable. The crowd, a sea of somber faces, held hands and prayed. As he spoke, a sudden ripple of data hit the global feeds. Anya's voice cracked over the comm system. Trajectory confirmed. Minimal deviation, but it's enough. The GPI's efforts, combined with the unsanctioned solution's tiny, crucial push, had worked. Neptune's course had been altered by a fraction of a degree. It would not collide with Earth. The world, which had been preparing for its final breath, suddenly had its future back. The news spread like wildfire. On the streets, the riots transformed into a stunned, quiet relief. The looting stopped. People simply stood in the streets, looking up at the sky, a strange mixture of tears and silent laughter on their faces. The world had been granted a reprieve, but it was a fragile, wounded world. The economy was shattered. The cover story was a lie. The GPI's authority was in question. The Church of the Dying Earth, having preached a finality that never came, was forced to redefine its mission. Marcus Thorne was now a king without a kingdom, a passenger on a ship to a dead planet. And Evelyn and Silas, anonymous heroes, were now faced with the terrifying reality of what they had done. They had saved a world that had not wanted them, and now they had to live in it. The reckoning was not in the stars but in the aftermath. The Global Phoenix Initiative. Chapter 23, Epilogue. 5 years after Neptune's close approach, the world was a study in paradox. The immediate fear had evaporated, replaced by a lingering, existential dread. The global economy, which had collapsed in a single day, was slowly and painstakingly being rebuilt on a new foundation of cooperation and suspicion. The GPI, no longer a clandestine organization, was now an official global governing body, its authority both absolute and deeply resented. In the aftermath of Neptune's passage, the world's governments crumbled. The cover-ups, the clandestine culling programs, and the failed space races were exposed by Ben Carter's data, fueling a global reckoning. The people, having witnessed their leaders' deceit and incompetence, turned their backs on the old order. National boundaries, currencies, and political ideologies suddenly seemed obsolete in the face of near extinction. Against this backdrop, the Global Phoenix Initiative, once a secretive task force, was the only organization left with any credibility. They were the ones who had worked tirelessly, in plain sight and in secret, to build a future. They had saved humanity, not just from the gravitational pull of Neptune, but from itself. The matter-antimatter beam, now a monument to human ingenuity and a symbol of their success, was a clear and powerful statement at a historic summit held in the ruins of Geneva, the former UN headquarters. The GPI leadership was unanimously voted in as the new interim world government. National armies were dissolved and replaced with a single, unified GPI security force. Global resources were pooled and redistributed based on a new, collaborative model. The GPI's core mission evolved from survival to rebuilding and, for the first time in history, humanity was a single, unified entity. Anya Sharma, once a leader of a secret organization, now found herself the de facto head of the entire human race. It was a daunting task, but one she was prepared to face. The old world was gone, and a new, more fragile one had taken its place, built on the ashes of what had been lost. Director Anya Sharma, now simply Director, was a different person. The exhaustion that had once been a temporary state was now a permanent part of her. She oversaw the slow, painful process of rebuilding from the ashes of the global recession. Her work was no longer about saving humanity but about managing it. The trust she had sacrificed for the world's survival was a debt that could never be repaid, and it was a burden she carried alone. Ben Carter, the data analyst, had found his calling. He was now a key figure in the new GPI's Public Information Department, tasked with preventing future cover-ups. He was no longer a conspiracy theorist, but a guardian of the truth, a man who had seen the worst of humanity's secrets and was now determined to keep them from festering. His work was a quiet penance for the panic he had helped unleash, a way to show that even in the darkest moments, truth could still prevail. In a small, remote village, the leader of the Church of the Dying Earth lived out his days as a simple spiritual guide. His followers, who had believed in a divine plan for the end of the world, were now a scattered and disillusioned flock. His sermons no longer spoke of apocalypse but of humility and the quiet strength found in everyday life. He had been a prophet of a future that never came, and his newfound wisdom was a reflection of the hard-won peace he had found in a world that refused to end. Marcus Thorne's fate was the most ironic of all. His Mars transport, a self-proclaimed ark for the elite, had reached Mars' orbit only to find a desolate, uninhabitable planet. The GPI, with all its public resources and knowledge, had been right about Mars being a dead end. Marcus was a king without a kingdom, a prisoner on a ship to a dead planet, and his private kingdom of wealth was now a useless currency. Dr. Evelyn Hayes and General Silas Stone Harding had found their own quiet corner of the new world. They had given the world a second chance, and in return, they had been left alone. They lived in a secluded cabin in the mountains, a place of peace and quiet. They were no longer heroes or rebels, just two people who had saved the world without a single person ever knowing their names. The reckoning was not in the stars, but in the new, quieter world they had helped create. A world forever changed by a lie and saved by a truth. We hope you enjoyed the Global Phoenix Initiative Neptune Falling and hope you come back to the Beneath the Hickory for future stories. If you enjoyed this story, please consider liking and subscribing to the channel.